Before getting the video underway, I want to give a big shout out to the homie Paco for hooking us up with the new logo and intro. If you're interested in getting a commission done, hit him up at Hella Digital on Instagram. His link will be in the description, and go show some support to the homie. Ni hao, hello, hola, welcome to another episode. Today we are going to be talking about the justice system and its disproportionality. And today we have some very lovely guests, and now I will let them introduce themselves.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Skylar. I am a second year at UPS, or University of Puget Sound. I'm involved in Phi Delta Theta fraternity, COMS, Coalition of Multiracial Biracial Students, and a whole bunch of other stuff on campus. And I'm also a psychology major and Spanish minor.
Hi, I'm Yuki. I am a senior this year, majoring in biochemistry with a minor in Spanish and business. I am the current president of the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity. And other than that, I'm in the Ultimate Frisbee team and some other stuff. Yeah.
For sure. Thank you guys for coming out today and having this conversation with us. So let's get right into it. Let me just pull up my questions. Okay. So to start off, I'm going to start off with a couple of just facts. Okay, so according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the U.S. population is about 328 billion people, about roughly, right? 76.3% of that is white, 13.4% is black, and 18.5% is Hispanic or Latino. According to the Sentencing Project, there are 2.2 million people in prisons and jails around the nation. 1 in 9 are men, 1 in 17 are white men, 1 in 3 are black men, 1 in 6 are Latino men, 1 in 56 are women, 1 in 101 are white women, 1 in 18 are black women, and 1 in 45 are Latino women. So before we go on to more questions, what are your guys' thoughts of these statistics I've just kind of spewed at you?
I mean, just looking at the numbers, there's like a disproportionality of like how many people, like who are incarcerated versus like what makes the US population.
Yeah. I think too, like, just based off all those numbers, it's interesting too, because I mean, given that the United States is, if not one of the leading countries in the world, but yet we have these large disparities in incarceration and just specific amounts of people, specifically for males. There's like a higher chance of males being incarcerated than women, and that is also a disparity in race too. So people of color or males of color are more likely to be incarcerated, which is both surprising, but I mean, once again, it's the reality that we live in.
Okay, so now I want to jump in by asking you a question. You mentioned there's a disparity in the people who are incarcerated, especially people of color. So I wanted to present to you this question. Do you believe POC are more likely to commit crimes? And would that back up these numbers?
That's a good, very good question. Because like when you put into perspective like arguments involving the justice system, and if different individuals are more likely to commit a crime, it's you right off the bat is a stereotype where, oh, obviously um, Black people are susceptible to more crimes, or will commit crimes more often. But we could kind of recognize that that isn't necessarily true. The initial thought, as I said, is yes, the people of color will commit more crimes, but I think ultimately I don't know any stats involving this kind of question, but in my opinion, I think it's fairly even, if not like the same. But
Right. And like just looking at the numbers, it would suggest that people of color do commit more crime, but um there like there's also like different types of crime and like the severity of it. And I think like in terms of like how the justice system like is carried out in the US, it doesn't really account for like the way like the opportunities in which these people were given at birth, which had nothing to do with like how hard they try in life and like how much work they do. And so that like a lot of the unfortunate like reality is that like Skylar said, is that like people of color do have less opportunity to succeed and um like have a stable income and have like a stable life to begin with in order to not have to commit these crimes, you know.
So I'm really glad you guys brought that up because a couple days ago, I was on Instagram and I was kind of just going through like the explore page, just because some videos catch my attention, and I actually saw this. It was like a portion of an interview where I think it was talking about the working world and how this white man said that the opportunities to get in a job isn't racial based, it's culturally based. And at the moment I didn't necessarily understand what he was kind of talking about. I was like, isn't race affecting the culture? But then as like I started thinking about it and considering this topic, I started thinking about the opportunities that people are presented. And initially this culture was built based off of certain ideals because of races, but nowadays it's more that this culture, because this culture is already established, it's prolonging this system where again people of color and more people of color than white people have less opportunities, are in situations where they need to commit like maybe petty crimes in order to survive or in order to basically live day by day. So potentially that's one answer to why the justice system is the way it is, and just it's not. There's external factors that are the culture of our nation and the culture of how people live affects what people are willing or need to do in order to survive. So that's just something really to keep in the back of your head, because you need to understand not everyone who is in jail went for a horrible crime. Not everyone who's in jail went in for a violent crime. Some people in jail could just be in there for a misdemeanor drug possession charge with no other background, nothing, just there on something that they got caught up, or just a slight robbery, anything, something that could potentially be nonviolent, which is something that could be misperceived, especially in the media, where they present to you all these people in jail that are in there for like murder, homicide, things of that nature, of just violent nature, when not everyone in the jail system is a violent offender. Okay, now I want to ask you, this is going to be a really broad question, but do you think our justice system works in the way it is right now?
no. Um, I think for me, the main reason is um, it's it allows people who have money to get out of certain situations, compared to people who don't. I think there is, I don't know, an instance, like what's his name, Kyle, the shooter from the protests where he got um,
Mhm.
where he shot people. I forgot in Missouri or somewhere, during one of the Black Lives Matter protests. I think it was Kyle Rittenhouse, something like that. He posted out for bail, so he got out of jail because of a parent. Some, I don't know who the source was or who paid for his bail, but someone paid for his bail, and he's out of jail now. Given that he killed three people at a protest carrying a firearms, um, it's like situations like that are like, okay, yeah, that you're able to. There's post bail and whatnot, um, but like these people who killed, and you were saying like the severity of the crime sometimes is a determining factor that often is what puts people in jail longer, or if not longer, because of money, they have to stay in jail for a certain amount of time before they can either go to court or anything like that. So it's like that disparity between wealth is also like a crossover with the justice system.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That like the current justice system that we have um, doesn't serve all Americans, all people equally on equal basis. It really ultimately comes down to how much money you have or how much power you have, how much influence you have. And so not everyone is, and not every like offense is looked at equally, unfortunately.
So another thing, you're mentioning how it comes down to money, power, and influence. And another thing I want to bring to you guys' attention is knowledge, and how the justice system, as we all know, can be a very complicated and difficult place to understand all the technical terms or everything that's going on. And I don't know if you guys have seen Law Abiding Citizen, but it's a really good movie. And basically, there's one scene in a courtroom where this guy is basically a genius. And for a couple years now, he was studying the law system and the justice system and just a whole bunch of things because he planned to commit murder. And he wanted to prove in a courthouse in front of a bunch of people that just by spewing a lot of jargon and by just presenting things that the system allows to happen would let him go free, basically. So he was accused of murdering viciously two men. um and but because he spewed out this jargon, because he spewed out these case laws, uh the judge was going to let him walk free and be out in the streets while he had his hearing. Um so it just comes to show, yes, it does come down to power, it comes down to money, but also it comes down to the a great form of power is knowledge. And not everyone is knowledgeable about certain aspects, as specifically in these communities where learning about the justice system might not be as important as learning how to live in these environments. So I definitely want to acknowledge that there is power involved, money, but knowledge is a very important thing that is lacking in some communities, whereas some other communities might have more access to knowledge or access to people with more knowledge, not necessarily being that person who is being defended.
Yeah. I'd like to add too that uh, within the justice system, I think rhetoric is a very important thing in terms of language. Like a lot, I would say, majority of people of color, specifically males, in the Latino community as well as the Black community, are labeled as criminals. Like even if, let's say, you're walking in the street, you put a hoodie on and dark clothes, you're maybe by someone you could be suspicious of being a gang member or carrying drugs, that, and be labeled as a criminal. Oh, I see this black male who I think is suspicious, so I'm calling the cops. At that point, you're going to be labeled as a criminal because of this language of, oh, he's suspicious because of this certain appearance, and therefore they have certain rights to uphold and within the justice system. And I think when you look at the justice system, it's like a I think now a profit system as well. Like you could make the argument that it's a new form of slavery because like given like the fires uh in California, they had some prisoners to do to like basically put out the fires because they didn't have enough um, firefighters. So they're the I guess prisoners are being exploited for different forms of manufacturing work and other like public work, even though they're still in jail and I guess like living their life in their sentences in
Mm.
prison. So
Well,
it's
I'm
a
glad you brought up the fact of like, that person could potentially be a drug dealer, and how, the prison system within the justice system is very much because we have private prison complexes and where they're making money off of prisoners. I'm really glad you brought that up because that leads in to some more facts I brought in today. So I don't know if you guys have seen the documentary The 13th. But within the documentary, they basically talk about this concept of how the 13th Amendment allowed for slavery after the abolishment of slavery, and how in the 13th, if I'm not mistaken, it says something along the lines of no one could be bound or forced into labor unless they are convicted of a crime or something like that. And then what also connects back to drugs, and how I connecting it back to the justice system, and how not only is it our little is it smaller aspects of people getting arrested day by day in our communities, but it reaches all the way to the top, to the presidency. If we look back at the war on drugs, specifically during the Ronald Reagan era, and we talk about how uh, cocaine in powder form was majority in white neighborhoods, just because it was seen more pure and more expensive to get this pure cocaine. Whereas crack, the solid or rock form of cocaine, was predominantly seen in more black neighborhoods or neighborhoods with people of color. And in the documentary, we can see how during sentencing, or during there was a legislation passed where basically 1 ounce of crack was the equivalent of 100 ounces of the powder, or just cocaine powder. And then in this specific instance in our history, coming stemming from the top of our government, stemming from the highest power that anyone could have in the United States, we see this disparity between different communities, which is being hidden behind some other aspect. And the Ronald Reagan called it the war on drugs, but in the film they say it wasn't really a war on drugs, it was more of a war on people. And basically you mentioned how people are kind of portrayed differently, and even back then in the media, how people of color, specifically young black men, were portrayed as predators, or the ultimate predator, and kind of seen as this scary entity that was out there to kind of get you or kill you or basically ruin your life. Right now, looking at how it was then, and looking at where we are now with like the legalization of weed, and these huge companies coming up of cannabis, or just how we live today, specifically on how legislation is affecting people's lives and what's legal and what's not, have things changed
I
for
think it
better or worse?
I think it has changed marginally, for the better. Um, this question about the the ethics of the war on drugs and the morality of the war on drugs has been coming up in many states, especially in the ones that have already legalized marijuana, right? And the idea that like people in the, at least like some people in the legislative branch have been realizing that like this war on drug was more of like a veil in order to hide the fact that it was basically like another form of redlining districts and like incarcerating especially like the Black community and the Latino community, right? And I think that's like the fact that people have started to realize and question the fact has been a step forward. Not necessarily the biggest step, but it's still, we're getting somewhere, I think.
Yeah. I think I would agree with that. Uh, there, as much as there has been a ton of effects, negative effects on these communities specifically, as I said, like Black communities, Latino communities, and other people of color, or yeah, communities of color. I mean, there's lasting effects, and I think when you look at the past or look at history and see where these programs now are affecting communities, I think, I mean, one, it's good to acknowledge, but I think another is how can we change and how can we move on from that. I know just in terms of the legalization of like marijuana and all that has um, had its benefits, but also it's um, become more stricter on some of these uh, reinforcement or drug enforcement in terms of the police and um, that sort of thing. So it still affects these communities, and I think when thinking about change and change to come, I mean the work is not over, um, and it, as I think as you kind of said too, it as much as it starts by like the people, it has to come from the leadership as well. And if the leadership is willing to change and willing to create better programs for individuals to come back into society um, when after they've finished their sentencing or whatever, ultimately down leads down to like leadership there and how well they could um, address the people's needs as well as their needs, if for better or for worse.
Mhm. And
Okay.
like, I think like going off of that, right? I think that like we've said, like some people say that like it's a culture thing, and that like I guess some people say how like the Black community has a culture of like stealing and like committing crime. But like if that were the argument, you can also flip it on the other side and explain away that the white community has a culture of benefiting from these like justice system and benefiting from like having these scapegoats called the Black and the Latino community. And if that is this, if that were the case in the United States, if that were the culture, I think it's up to the leadership, like Skylar said, to change this culture. Because culture is only like what, like dead people peer pressuring us to do one thing,
Yeah.
right? So it's like really up to these like legislative leaders to like really push forward and like rethinking and reshaping what America can be.
Okay, so definitely so we've talked about, we're focusing on legislative aspects of it. We're talking about, the head of our nation, basically. But now I want to draw us back, bring out our magnifying lens and kind of focus on a more specific aspect of everyday life. Because, we don't deal with the president every day. Like the president isn't pulling us over, isn't coming to our house to, to search if we're doing something bad. some might disagree. Some might say pigeons are spying on us by the government, whatever you want to believe, you know. But I definitely want to, pull out a magnifying glass and look at a more impactful or more prevalent aspect in our everyday lives, which is the police force. And obviously, in recent days, in recent months, and recent times, really, we have seen how the police force or different policemen have done questionable things, very horrific things, and they have been able to get away with it. They haven't been held accountable. So I want you to think about this commonly heard uh, ideology, theory, whatever you want to call it, that the police live by, supposedly. So, what are your thoughts on the idea of protect and serve? And how is it as an ideology, and how is it put in practice?
Well, if you want to break it down, we'll break it down. Protect. So protect. Literally, no one. There's no specific person you're protecting. So everyone. And then serve. Also, not. There's no specific person. And serve is there's almost a two-way street there. There's not. You're not. You're not deciding the fate of someone's life, so to speak, or the fate of someone's decision making, but you're rather serving the people both on both sides, serving them in not continuing any sort of violent action and serving the community so that they don't get hurt. I think when it's interesting because that's what they live by and that's what their their values are. um, and I get that there's the argument, oh, the police have this dangerous job and they're put into difficult situations, and that also goes involved with like is training. Does more training need to be required to like de-escalate or not even engage in combat? Because there's nothing in that value where you have to commit to violence or any sort of violence whatsoever, right? So like, does there really need to be violence or whatever? Because I remember I was at a I think it was at University of Puget Sound. They had I think it was like the Red Door Project or something, in terms of it was like a play, uh, and they talked about the perspective of the police, and one of the actors who was portraying a police woman actually was saying that was giving like a public service announcement, and she said that if you call the police, we're bringing a gun with them. So you're bringing someone who has a violent weapon to a situation that maybe isn't that violent. Like, I don't know, intruder. Well, I don't really know any. um I don't have anything off the top of my head in terms of that, but like you're making the situation worse by bringing the police because they have a gun and because they're perceived in this manner of different identities and like being law enforcement and being so brutal that this would escalate the situation rather than de-escalate the situation. So I think just going off that, definitely language is a big thing, and those values can describe a lot.
Yeah, I think you like brought up like a really interesting point, and that like you said how like protecting and serving is a two-way street, and that like they have as much of like a job to protect and serve the community as much as a job to protect the supposed like criminals, right? Because they're part of the community.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very interesting point, and we definitely do not see that in practice, unfortunately. And like it's also an interesting like um, point of view. You pointed out how like bringing the police to a non-violent situation could make the situation more violent, and I think that's very correct. And like given their ability to bring force and violence with like a metal gun, um, should be like considered and like thought of in terms of like what type of situation they're putting themselves into.
I'm glad you guys brought that up. And that idea of a two-way street and how the police officers are meant to protect and serve not only the innocent people in our communities, but also, these perpetrators or these people that they're arresting. And I just want to bring up some like ideas, some events that have happened where this two-way street of protecting and serving hasn't exactly been put into practice, or scenarios where bringing a police officer to a certain event could make the things more hostile. And basically we can see how there's a discrepancy between how some police officers interact with certain people based on really their background, what they look like, their identities, and just these different things. So for example, if you remember back when I think it was Batman The Dark Knight premiered, and there was that cinema shooting of the white man who dressed up like the Joker and shot up the movie theater, and I believe injured and killed a whole bunch of people. But the police were able to safely apprehend the subject, and I think they said that there was like no shots fired from the police, and they were able to safely get him in handcuffs into the police car without any damages to that person. But then we look at an instance like with Rodney King, where he was a peaceful man driving, he gets pulled over in LA, and then, like, I don't remember how many cops it was, but they viciously beat him to death, or they just beat him. Or we could see other instances today where it'll be a person of color when interacting with the police, and the police will escalate this situation one way or another by pulling a gun, or by, we have seen how police officers try to apprehend these people by choking them. We have seen people of color in chokeholds. We have seen people of color with knees on their necks, preventing them from living, like putting their life in risk. Whereas with these white perpetrators, they're safely apprehending them, and they show up on the media, they show up in court, no bruises, completely clean, like safe. Whereas these people of color are showing up in the media, they're showing up afterwards, they're showing up to their courts very bruised and battered. And it just shows you how there's a discrepancy in this idea of protect and serve, because it is supposed to be a two-way street, and that sometimes it is, but there are occasions where this just isn't true. And the proof is in the pudding. You can see some people do get treated differently, and that's where there's a lot wrong. So, real quick, last question. How do you think we could change this, or what do you think we can do about this? Because I know you mentioned, Skylar, you said, maybe more training is needed. So, what would that look like, or what can we do? I know there was a comedian said a joke. He said, if we want to stop racism in cops, we need to make all cops people of color. All cops have to be people of color. They can't be any white cops. So that way there isn't any racism in the police force, right? And then all firefighters will be white people. And obviously this is a joke. Um, but how do you think we could solve this problem? How do you think we can move, not completely solve it, because obviously this is a very systemic, a very long process that we need to address and that we need to kind of focus on, but what could potentially lead us to take some steps in a positive direction?
I think the first step, which we still have yet to take, is to acknowledge the problem unanimously, that there is a problem in the justice system. I think the country currently is very split on whether or not we even have a problem in the justice system. And I firmly believe that we do, and we must agree upon that terms to begin the process of healing.
Okay.
I think for me, I'm gonna stick with my training aspect of reforming, I guess, the justice system and the police departments. I think with training, that involves like knowing your history, knowing, because this all of this doesn't isn't gonna, or didn't come out of the blue. This came out of history, like decades upon decades of uh, disparities with how people handled different types of people, or racism evolving within generations. And knowing that you can, the importance of like training and like all this like critical race theory and all that, that is just an empathy thing, and learning empathy through the experiences of others. Because through in Black communities and Latino communities, they're passing on these experiences from generation to generation, so they're more exposed to these disparities than, let's say, white people who don't get the same treatment as um, people of color. So they're almost blinded by uh, not really ignorance, but like just the culture. We were talking about just the culture and the language. That in and of itself is a barrier for all communities. And I think acknowledging that and then moving forward through learning through history and the ways we could possibly go about that, and just continuing to learn. I think at this moment where internet is vast and we're able to do a ton of research, I think now is more important than ever for people to do research and even just like learn about the history of the United States, because as I said, this didn't come out of the blue. It's been generations upon generations of trauma and racism.
I think one more thing off of that is that like the people who serve us in the police force and the justice department should not only know about the history of their own system, but also the community in which they serve. And I think that it would be best if we can like have policemen and policewomen who actually live in that community, serve in that community.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming out today and having this conversation with us. Thank you to all the viewers for coming out, showing some support. Make sure you check out previous videos. Make sure you show some support here, and we'll see you guys next time.
See you guys.
Thank you.